right, we've got folks trickling in here. Why don't we go ahead and get started? It's good to be with you all. Good afternoon from the Collegeville Institute. Welcome to Collegeville Connections, our new series of online events through the Collegeville Institute, which is located on the campus of St. John's University in central Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of program alumni and friends from across the spectrum of Institute programs. We wanted to offer an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other during these pandemic times and to the Collegeville Institute. And we're so eager for you today to learn about one of our major initiatives. My name is Jessie Bazan. I'm the program associate for the Collegeville Institute Calling Initiatives. And before I introduce my colleagues and our guests for today, I want to turn it over to Susan Sink, who's helping with the tech side of things. See if there's anything, Susan, that we should know.
So hello to all of our attendees. Thank you for tuning in. And I'm just going to be behind the scenes, kind of running things. We will have a question and answer period at the end. And I ask that you have any questions, just type them in. If you hover at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So please don't use chat, but just use the Q&A for anything, any concerns you have or anything you want to say. I'll be moderating those and then we'll ask them at the end. If there's any just purely kind of technical housekeeping questions, you can also put them in there and I'll answer you directly. And then the other thing is we are recording this on Facebook Live and it will be available as a link later on today. And you will get, as someone who registered, you will get an email with that link to share. And if you happen to lose your connection, you can just go over to the Collegeville Institute Facebook page and pick it up there. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Lots of good ways to connect. So I am so pleased to be joined here today by my colleague, Reverend Dr. Jane Patterson, a priest in the Episcopal Church, New Testament scholar, and the program director of the Communities of Calling Initiative. For those who may not be familiar, the Communities of Calling Initiative is an ecumenical initiative that aims to help Christian congregations deepen their sense of calling. Jane and I are really lucky to be working with 13 phenomenal congregations across the country. And today we're joined by two of those fantastic leaders from two of the churches. Tom Falquist, who's a member of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Spokane, Washington, and Carol Younger of Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, New York. And we're all here today to talk about metaphor as a tool that can be useful in discernment. Now, if you joined us last week, you got a great example of metaphor use in action when Rachel Twig Boyce presented on her congregation's weaving project and using how that metaphor of weaving can be helpful in prompting vocational reflections. So we're hopeful that between the two presentations, you'll have a good idea of how you might be able to use metaphors to aid in your own discernment. You know, certainly these days we're all asking big life questions about our meaning and our purpose, what God is calling us to do, who God is calling us to be. And these are some of the types of questions that we carried into a retreat last fall. Jane and I gathered Communities of Calling Initiative team members from each congregation for a virtual retreat where we had a lot of fun playing with the metaphors of pottery and considering how different elements of pottery, like the potter, clay, fire, can illuminate some aspects of our callings. And you know, we so look forward to welcoming participants to Collegeville each year. You know, that's a real treat. And the specialness of this place can't totally be replicated online, but we were able to switch to a virtual gathering this year. And we still wanted to give folks a sense of the place of Collegeville. And we thought there was no better way to do that than to connect with the good people at St. John's Pottery Studio, who literally use the earth under our feet to create beautiful pieces of art. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jane, who's going to introduce the concept of metaphor a little more. And then we'll spend time in conversation with Tom and Carol, really exploring how the metaphor of fire in particular has been useful in their own discernments, again, as a way of modeling how metaphors might be helpful in your own lives. So Jane.
Thank you so much, Jesse. So I'm going to share a resource that we developed for our retreats on vocation and metaphor. So this is the teaching on metaphor that we used with our 13 congregations before our fall retreat. Many of them had already been working with some of the metaphors that kind of naturally arise around questions of vocation, but we wanted to take some time to examine why metaphors are actually so useful in thinking about calling before we entered into some imaginative work with those metaphors arising from St. John's Pottery Studio, the potter, the earth, the fire. And we also talked about the people who purchase and use the pottery, but of course, they're not metaphorical, but they are an important part of it. And all of us in our vocations have people we serve and who are important to it. So where metaphors fit into a process of discernment. Kathleen Cahalan created a resource for our congregational teams on the process of vocational discernment. You can find that resource on the Communities of Calling webpage. But this slide locates the use of metaphors in the process she describes from initial experiences of a potential calling. That's down on the bottom, experience leading to narrative. And sort of moving up through this toward making some preliminary choices. And metaphor is really important at that midpoint, after we've learned to begin to tell a story of how something's kind of tugging on us, but we need to reflect back on our story and make some sense of it and see exactly how we're being called through that story. So you see metaphor in the middle here when we're engaging, listening, seeking, waiting, choosing. So now this is the nerdy part of this. So my dissertation was on a set of biblical metaphors in the letters of Paul. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how it is that metaphors work. So historically, metaphors were considered by many, not by absolutely everyone, but by most people, to be kind of like a decoration that's added onto ordinary, straightforward speech. But in the mid-20th century, interdisciplinary scholars and scientists began to develop what came to be known as the cognitive theory of metaphor, the sense that metaphors are actually embedded in how human beings think and acquire new understandings of the world based upon the things that we already know. They are not just decorative, and they actually cannot be replaced by simpler terms. Even the term calling is, of course, a metaphor. And it's one that some of us have actually had to work against to help people get over the idea that they will hear a clear voice from heaven telling them what to do. Though some people do have an experience like that, for most of us, calling is a metaphor for a gradual realization over time of a direction in the world that feels right. So one of the things that I've begun to see more and more clearly, especially in the last year, is that vocation is actually a very complex theological idea. It's not one thing, it's really a compendium of lots of things. So it's a very complex theological experience arising from our relationship with God over time. The idea of vocation comes with a lot of assumptions about how God works in the world and how God relates to human beings. Does God plan out everything ahead of time? How much freedom do human beings have to decide our destinies? Is everything that happens actually intended by God? How does human sinfulness put limits on our knowledge and power? Does salvation happen in a moment at baptism or over time? Is our creation complete at birth, or do we complete it over the course of our lives as we live into our callings? All of these notions undergird our ability to think about how God might be calling us. This theological complexity of calling creates a situation that is ripe for metaphor, because metaphors help us move from something we know, like the experience of walking on a path, to something harder to see and know, like how God is calling us into new experiences and relationships. So sometimes a metaphor is so terrific that it does what people who work on metaphors say. We say it becomes a dead metaphor, it dies, because we cease to remember that the is not quality of metaphor, which is really what gives them their life. It's what makes them playful, is that they are not actually the thing that we're talking about. That, I think, is what has sort of happened with that metaphor of the path. Although it's such a rich metaphor for thinking about vocation that the more you play with it, the more you stretch it and pull on it, you can find life in it again. So this is one of the most important things about metaphor, and especially when we think about metaphors and discernment. The path is a great example of the predictive power of metaphor. Once you have the image of the path, you can explore what kind of a path you're on. Is it rocky? Is it well marked? Is it steep, confusing, well-traveled, unfamiliar, dangerous? And you can use the ways in which you manage an actual path to help you figure out what to do when things get confusing or difficult. Do you need to sort of create a map, so to speak? Do you need friends on the journey with you? Do you need to consult someone who's walked this way before? The metaphor of the path offers a really versatile means of carrying out finer levels of vocational discernment, because there's so many kinds of paths and so many different ways for a person to relate to a path. Even you might have to make your own path. Maybe it doesn't exist and you gotta like carve your way through the forest. One of the interesting chapters in the history of metaphors was the use in the 19th century of metaphors of water to predict what electricity might do. And we still use those metaphors when we speak of electrical currents and the flow of electricity. When scientists weren't sure how to predict where electricity would go, this metaphor proved highly predictive, even though water and electricity also have some very different characteristics. So another thing to sort of pay attention to with metaphors when we start using them in discernment is that they both reveal and conceal. One really fruitful way to work with metaphors is to ask yourself, what does this metaphor show me? And what does it hide from me? For instance, the metaphor of vocation as a seed that has been implanted in us from the beginning conceals the fact of all the other experiences that have brought us to make a particular vocational choice. If any of those opportunities or barriers had not occurred, would we have made exactly these choices? Would a disability keep us from being able to give life to that seed? And yet there's a very common sense among people who have deep satisfaction from a calling that I was made for this, so that there's that seed feeling often. So one of the complexities of vocation is that opposing things can seem to be true all at once. And metaphors already contain within themselves some of that complexity. But something else to pay attention to when you're choosing metaphors as an aspect of your discernment is that metaphors imply agency. They bring with them a set of assumptions and dynamics of relative power or agency. Some of the assumptions that might get brought in with the metaphor of the path are maybe that someone has created the path and already knows where it goes, or that everyone who walks on the path will have the same experience, that the path has a purpose and a rationale, that You always know whether or not you're on the path. Because the image of the path is so versatile, it actually also lends itself to going against the grain and saying, I'm making my own path now, or I just found out that what I've been doing isn't really a path at all. But many metaphors break down when read against the grain like that. So an example would be this familiar passage on the potter and the clay from Isaiah. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are the potter. We are all the work of your hand. So there are actually two metaphors here, God as Father and God as potter, with the human being as a child or as the clay. Biblical metaphors are often mixed like this, no matter what your 7th grade English teacher told you about not mixing metaphors. And embedded in this particular use of the metaphor of potter and clay is the fact that the potter is assumed to be the one with personal agency, while the clay is at least relatively inert. Now, Richard Bresnahan, the principal potter at St. John's, actually complicates this metaphor by talking about how he partners with the clay and really takes the clay into account when he's working with it. But Isaiah was writing from a context in which the people needed a way to sense and trust the overarching power of God in a time of political weakness. Isaiah's expression of trust in God's creative power was a bold prophetic claim in a time of suffering and confusion. The metaphor of potter and clay is strategic and contextual, but many theological metaphors contain assumptions about power and agency, parent and child, sovereign and people, shepherd and sheep. So it's important to note where a metaphor might make discernment difficult by closing off a person's process of really appropriate agency. So finally, metaphors have their limits. You can't just take a metaphor and run with it forever. It doesn't usually work to stretch our interpretation to include absolutely everything that the metaphor might suggest. For instance, when Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep in John 10, he's making a pretty focused comparison. As the word or the logos, the logic of God, he connects God's people with both safety and the nourishment we find out in the wide world. He creates the trustworthy connection between those two realities. But actual gates have no agency of their own, no thoughts, no mercy. It's easy to see the limits on a metaphor like the gate, but it's important to ask ourselves when we have reached the limits on other important vocational metaphors, like responding to a summons or navigating a map or drinking a cup of blessing or tribulation. Every compelling metaphor comes with a set of assumptions and implications, and not all of them are helpful for tracking the unfolding of a person's vocation. So as we talk about callings and the metaphor of fire today, let's keep in mind these characteristics of metaphors. They're predictive, they reveal and conceal, they are and are not like the thing they refer to, they imply agency and power, and they have limits. The wide variety of biblical metaphors for our interactions with God give us potentially very subtle tools for helping people respond to their callings in very different contexts. I hope what we do here today is helpful to your own processes of discernment.
Thanks so much, Jane. It's wonderful. I'm going to switch and share my screen now here. As you made a great point that there are so many different types of metaphors that could be used. Just in your presentation alone, I was counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different metaphors that you put forth. There are millions out there that can be helpful when doing discernment work. And as we mentioned, we chose the metaphor of pottery intentionally and for a few reasons. So as I mentioned before, St. John's pottery is an important focal point of campus life in Collegeville. It connects to the sense of place, as well as the intentionality and the stability that are so important to Benedictine life and our Benedictine life here in Collegeville. We thought that the metaphor of fire in particular draws out the dynamic nature of calling. Now, before I change the slide, I'll point out for those who haven't been, this is the pottery studio itself. It's a group of folks enjoying the 3 o'clock tea time. It'll be a treat when that's open again. So again, the metaphor of fire we think can be really dynamic, and just a quick visual image here so that you get a sense of the kind of fire that we're imagining. I've got some photos from the fall 2019 firing of the Johanna kiln here in Collegeville. It's the largest wood-fired kiln in North America. And it's neat, teams of artists and community members stoke the fire for 10 days. So we've got fire here during the daylight, and then this photo taken in the evening. And this would be the fire and flames shooting out of the third chamber. And again, it's really incredible, the magnitude of the flames. And as we reflected on this process with our retreatants and showed them some of these images, we started hearing comments like, yeah, you can't drink liquid from an unfired cup. The firing is necessary, no matter how dangerous and potentially painful it is. And you see these flames are really big, and that they're getting very close to. And someone commented, the same is true for difficult discernment when it has to be made. It can be challenging and painful, but in order to live into the fullness of my calling, I have to step into that fire, right? In the same way that the clay vessel needs to be put into the fire of the kiln in order to be able to be used ultimately. Someone else added, isn't there always a fire in congregational life too? Which I thought was a great question. Like we move from firing to firing. It's not like one ends and another one starts. So between seeing these incredible images, which were taken by Nate Jorgensen, as well as we sent each participant of the retreat a cup that either Richard Bresnahan or apprentice Daniel Smith made, and where we can really see the markings of the fire on these cups. Tom, I think this is the one that we sent to you. This offered us the opportunity to really reflect more deeply on our callings and gave us some common imagery to play around with. There's a lot more that could be said there on pottery, but we're focused on metaphor here for today. So again, we're so glad to have Tom Falquist and Carol Younger with us. These are two team members who were on our retreat this fall and who have been part of the Communities of Calling initiative since day one. And they're here today to reflect on their own callings in light of the fire metaphor, and in doing so to witness how metaphor can be a useful tool for discernment. So Tom and Carol, let's just dive right in. Maybe I'll throw the first question to you, Tom. When you're thinking about your vocations, what vocations are solidifying or taking shape for your congregations after a fire you endured this year? So thinking about the many fires of this time of pandemic and literal fires for you all out west, what vocations are taking shape for your congregation?
Thanks, Jesse and Jane, for all of this introduction. It's just a real pleasure to join my cohort, Carol, this morning or this afternoon in your case. Carol and I are on complete opposite sides of the United States, which is such an exciting component of the initiative, bringing us all together. And the cup is a beautiful cup. I love it. But I think what we have learned as a congregation is that fire is a very good metaphor to describe all of the energy, the cleansing, the passion, the courage, the strength, and of course the presence of God as we move through through the fears of all that has been taking place in this realm of life we're in, and bring us to purpose. Those discernment modules of listening, seeking, waiting, and choosing, as we seek guidance from the Holy Spirit about our vocation, especially during these difficult circumstances. At St. Mark's, we early on created the theme of called to trust God's future. And that embraces the not knowing, a deeper trust, which is very much a part of that waiting module. But within the congregation, there are so much activity, which I think has kind of surprised us all, especially following the fires of the Northwest and significant smoke that just, in addition to pandemic isolation and social distancing and protecting ourselves for weeks, just kept us isolated in our homes because the smoke was so toxic. But those flames have ignited faith and have been inspiring us every day, knowing that we are led into tomorrow, not only as individuals, but as a community. And all of the efforts toward finding new ways, new growth to serve one another.
Thank you, Tom. That's so rich, probably in particular because your community had seen literal flames and experienced that in a really intense way this summer, to then be able to reflect on how can those flames be energizing and life-giving. I appreciate, what does it look like to trust in God's movements, even through what might be painful and kind of scary. Thank you. Carol, what about you? Thinking about vocations that have been taking shape, solidifying for your congregation after a fire, a metaphorical fire that you all have endured this year. And I know there have been too many to choose from.
Well, so we built our project for Communities of Calling on the metaphor of a language school. And so that's kind of been a working metaphor for us. And we chose that one because we were trying to discern, what should our project be? And we realized that our congregants would really easily talk about their work and the joys and stress of their week and their daily life. But we were much more reluctant to talk about, how our questions and our experiences and our concerns impact our spiritual life. And so usually the topic of our dailiness and our spirits were separate topics. And so that tendency, I think, reflects our New York City setting and our culture. But we also claimed this longing for a community where we could be fluent and merge both those conversations and talk about how do our daily lives affect our faith and vice versa. And so we were looking for ways to be fluent in that with the sound of the genuine. And we were developing listening skills and some discernment processes, and looking at familiar words in new ways about our faith and practicing new vocabulary. And by this time last year for Lent, we felt like we were on a roll, and we had a strong response to small groups, and important conversations were taking place, and something new was rising. And then COVID hit, or the brilliant metaphor of the fire arrived. And then also the widespread intensity of the George Floyd protests hit and engaged us. And so everything changed. I mean, it felt like we were consumed consumed physically, emotionally, logistically, spiritually. And there were reports that 40% of our neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights left the city. And so our church was scattered. And we were connected virtually through worship, but geographically we were distant, and we still are. And we're still kind of just figuring out who's back and who's in California and who's other places. And so, so even in July, a portion of us started to gather, on Sundays in the sanctuary, very socially distant, no singing, no hugging, no handshaking, waves for passing the peace, and a very contemplative style of service. But even still, there's still a lot of our congregation online and scattered. So I resonated so much with when Jane taught us that metaphors help us move. The fire metaphor has been a really good picture to hold on to in this time, to help us picture not only, where we are on the map, but maybe where we're heading, or maybe some of the questions we need to be thinking about. And it feels a lot like a Lectio Divina exercise when you have these metaphors, that they sort of show up like a taxi and you get in and it takes you somewhere you need to go. And so the metaphor of fire for us and its role in making pottery reminded our team that we don't control this process, that surprise is a major factor. Tom mentioned that surprise is another name for God, maybe, but a major factor in our experience. And our team has talked some about how the fact that we can't accurately measure programs like we used to, or we would be totally depressed, or that we can't make long-term plans right now. We can't confidently put anything on the calendar for sure, like we used to. It's made us less invested in the numbers, and it's made us more committed to being faithfully devoted. So it's been a perfect time to focus on faithfulness and to measure our work differently. So in terms of our first year project, we sort of moved our language school from language 101 classes into language immersion, like learning how to think and talk and find, words of faith that are real to us in this time. And so, the things that are rising are survival words and questions like, what are the essentials that sustain a church? And what can we offer people now, even if we can't physically be with them? And how do we find new ways to lament? How do we even make room for lament in our lives? How do we nurture our souls as our routine forms of church change or inaccessible to some? How do we become the body of Christ when we're socially and geographically distant? How do we keep feeding our creativity and flexing those muscles? How do we share our field notes with each other from all this experience? How do we recreate a narrative for our church and for ourselves? So our Lenten groups look really different this year. Like, we're not in our fellowship hall signing up and sharing coffee and being all excited about it. But we've had a group gather weekly to have these kind of conversations and talk about, what has surprised you over this course of a year, and what has sustained you over this course of the year, and how, and those conversations have been very life-giving to us. And so how can we make those kind of conversations accessible to more people? And so we do have some small groups rising out of this. And our Lenten theme for worship this time is going to be the 7 last words from the cross. And so we're finding some metaphors within those words of Jesus that move us to some new places. Words about forgiveness, eternity, family, thirsting, honest doubt, and staying true to our purpose and trusting God with our lives. So it's interesting that I feel like the first year was a gift to build some of that. And even though it feels like the fire burned it all down, it's still it it's still a structure kind of within, and it's still, it still had some seeds that we're gonna draw on this year, even though it looks really different. So
Yeah. Thank you, Carol. I appreciate those difficult but really important questions that your congregation is asking, and just it's clear just the language that you're using to talk about this time of firing, that there is both a real destruction that's taken place and that you're noticing things that are rising from it, and that's it shows the both, and that there's the complexities, Jane, like you talked about, of calling. Jane, I'm wondering if anything here is sticking out to you. You know, the two of us have listened and kind of journeyed alongside many congregations now, and all of whom are facing fires in their own ways. Anything that you'd like to share about what Tom and Carol have been saying?
Sure. Well, they've caused me to remember something that came up when we had the retreat, and then something that has come up for me since that sort of involves fire. So during the retreat, something that came out in our conversation that I think applies to how a lot of people in leadership in churches are feeling right now, that in the interviews with Richard Bresnahan, the potter, he talked about the decision to fire for exactly 10 days. And he said that when he was trained in Japan, I think they fire for 14 days. But he said, with the people that we have, the number of people that we have, and the amount of wood that we can take off the land, the limit on our capacity is every other year for 10 days. And I was aware of how much during the time of the pandemic, clergy have been fueling their congregations off their own imagination and spirit, and lay leaders as well. Like, it has been off their own bodies that, in a way, these congregations have been enabled to continue. But there's a limit to that. And I think all of us are asking, like, when do we need to find another fuel, or how are we going to refuel these congregational leaders so that we can continue? Because there's just so much wisdom. It struck me as such a Benedictine approach, that to accept a natural limitation. And I thought that was really beautiful in Richard's teaching, and was significant to us when we were engaging it. And then the other thing that's somewhat related is I keep having the image of the pilot light in the stove, that you can't cook unless the pilot light is lit. And I wonder whether during COVID, people are really struggling to keep that pilot light lit so that there's this liveliness. And especially now as we go into, we all keep saying, oh my gosh, it's been almost a year. And I feel like many of us, when we hit March 13th, that was kind of a watershed date, that the reality of how long this is, how, sustaining our energy and our fire, our inner fire, over this long period of time is very hard. And that's another aspect of vocational care, is how to keep your own, or how we as communities help one another keep our inner fires lit. That's what was coming up for me when I was listening. And I just love hearing about your congregations.
Absolutely. I think, Jane, you're talking, and Tom and Carol in your comments have pointed to these multiple levels of calling, right? That we're called as a community, as a congregation, and trying to discern that together is one aspect. Another aspect is the individual callings. Every single member of a congregation is called by God in a myriad of ways. And so this really does get complex. And so I'm wondering, Tom and Carol, as leaders in your congregation, what came out of the fire for you in terms of your own vocation? Maybe Tom, if you'd kick us off.
Yeah, Jane, I love your that image of the pilot light, and we have learned so much in the calling initiative about listening with our hearts, seeing with our hearts. And so that image of fire in the heart, when you talk about the pilot light, comes to mind. Um, I think personally for me, the year and especially the fire that just devastated this area so significantly in September. And I thought I had a good handle on this term dynamic of our callings, but it really took me deeper in the sense of just how dynamic, and even in the midst of thinking that things are so difficult and that we're in such a difficult season and realm of life, still how much more they can change. And that dynamic dial can just continue to turn up, both with suffering and pain and devastation, but also with joy and blessings, and how that dynamic cycle just works together, and being aware of it, and the trust that is involved during that dynamic work, how important that is in our faith. You know, what hit me from the retreat, it all hit me, but that night before, in our preparation and meditation, the prayer, the last sentence of that very short prayer, in the name of the Spirit, who is the fire of life. That was a significant prayer, and I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's so neat to see the ways that your own call to trust in these next steps and trust in the dynamic nature of calling is a way that you're living out your congregation's calling, this call to trust God's future. Right? That's the mission of your congregation in this project.
Yes.
It's also, I'm seeing how it's playing out in your own personal life,
Yes.
which I think is exactly what congregations are hoping for. So kudos to St. Mark's. Carol, what about you and your own callings? What's coming out of the fire of this time for you?
Well, I went back to a prayer from that retreat as well. I don't know whether you or Jane or Jesse wrote this or not, but it would these words: give us such trust in your sure purpose that we measure our lives not by what we have done or failed to do, but only by our faithfulness to you and by the light of your love for us. Amen. Those lines held so much light for me. I'm an editor of a devotional magazine, and I'm also a writer who has very many incomplete manuscripts of my own. And so I've tended to separate those two job descriptions of mine, and I really enjoy editing. I've done that for 7 years, but my real work, I've always told myself, will be the books that I have not written yet. And so I've kind of had this in my mind of, that's your real vocation, that's your real job, and it's off out in the distance a bit. But what the metaphor of the fire has moved me to see is this truth that faithfulness is a better measurement for our vocation than what we have or haven't done yet. And so in terms of my work, the refining of the fire, or the editing, or the simplifying, or the being part of the work of a community is a form of creating. I mean, it is a form of writing. And some of my individual writing has happened when I helped develop someone else's work or enabled that work to sing. So the fire metaphor, I think, that has been so great to me about this initiative is that it's helped me see vocation in broader terms, that it's not really, our vocation, our work is not just mine or just yours or even just ours, but that it's God's, and that we're invited to share in it together. And so the fire has kind of refocused my vocational interest, and I hope I'm less concerned about, the single byline or something larger than the book project. I hope that what I take away is this idea that I want to be part of creating something larger within this community of Christ Church, and that I want to be part of. I told some friends last week that I just want to be good dirt. Like, I want to be part of nurturing good soil, so that it's more important in my aging process and all too, is just that you see something grow all together as a community, that becomes more important than and that what grows is obviously God's work and not, any individual. And so that's my hope. That I don't know if it's taken yet, but that's my hope out of this project and this metaphor.
Yeah, it's a beautiful prayer, Carol, and I am appreciative of the generosity of your understanding of calling, and just the openness, expansiveness of it as you are trying to figure out what this means in your own life as someone who has a relationship with God and is in relationship with many people in the congregation and in the broader world. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Maybe a little shameless plug for the Collegeville Institute, but because you talked about your call as a writer, I wanted to just make note that this summer we have an opportunity for folks who are writing about vocation, people like Carol, to come and join a writing workshop. So maybe Stina or Susan could link to that in the chat. But if anyone participating, Carol, Tom, anyone watching this might be interested in exploring calling and what that means as a writer, we'd encourage you to check out that writing workshop. Okay, we've got a little while here, a couple minutes left. Jane, was there anything that you wanted to say before we move to some questions?
I was just going to underscore something from what I heard Carol and Tom both saying, and because we heard Carol last, I think people will have resonating in their minds a couple images she used that I think are really important for vocation. What I'm thinking is the way that vocation breaks down our sense of subject and object. So I have a calling and I do something to or for someone else. But really, one of the most significant things we do is evoke callings in others. And I noticed how Carol talked about how people in her congregation pull callings out of her. And the fact that, like, she had to sometimes stop herself and think, no, my calling isn't this like writing thing. Like it's these people are actually pulling writing out of me. Like if I attend to what these people are asking from me, like that actually fuels the writing also. Like they sort of pull it out. And when you said, I think I just want to be really good dirt for other people's callings, I thought, well, that's the thing, like, right? You want to also be the evoker, like the person who helps other people realize their callings and kind of helps pull it out of them so they can see it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's all wrapped in there for sure.
Yes. It's so deeply in the fabric of community. Like that is where it's happening, not inside the individual, I think.
Right. Yeah. Well, that comment, Jane, actually leads nicely into one of the questions that we've gotten from an audience member who says that my sense is that the metaphor of fire has become limited by some of the ways it's used in our church, as in connoting a particular type of energy, a charisma, personality. And this person's wondering, how do these connotations affect how you or your community play with the metaphor of fire in your discernment? So I'll throw that out, and if anyone feels compelled to answer, go for it.
I think, I don't know if this will get at the question or not, but I was working with, I was editing some material on Pentecost, and the writer had talked about trying to help the church see that we should break out of our idea of doing it. We shouldn't be afraid of the fire that comes at Pentecost and being, breaking out of the building and doing these things we haven't done before. And yet, as I was editing it, all the news of the wildfires were happening. And I just thought, there was just this huge mixed metaphors, like you thought. It was like saying, are we too safe with fire? And then it's like, yeah, but do you want to go to, this side of it? But I kind of wrestled with that idea a little bit and realized, so there's the uncontrollable part of fire that as a metaphor, but the thing about Pentecost was that fire was life-giving. It didn't, it wasn't destructive in one sense. I mean, I guess it's like you say, Jane, metaphors can be both, can be complex and, I guess you could say it destroys some forms of church that maybe we don't want to. But just that idea that if we get to the idea of that fire is life-giving and that it creates something, the editing process, the refining process may take away some things, but it produces something too. That's, I don't know, rambling there, but.
Oh, I also heard in it, this thing that happens where we get so used to a certain metaphor. This is what I was kind of saying about dead metaphors. Like we tame them when they were supposed to be alive. So as you were saying, Carol, like just go ahead and let that fire of Pentecost, like let it be wild, let it push you out, let it scare you, let it do all these things. And I think, yeah, because we tend to think symbolically in church, then we tame all those symbols and they can't do the work that they originally were intended to do. It's kind of a quandary. We're always, like in the Transfiguration, we're always making 3 booths and trying to hunker down in a place instead of just letting it erupt and letting the metaphor continue to surprise and challenge us.
Yeah. Like we edit our prayers so much, because we want to make sure it's theologically safe and sound, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's good, but also, yeah, where do you lose something in the honesty of it, I guess?
Sometimes we get afraid. I think that the thought police will come get us, for some word in our prayer.
Tom, anything you'd like to add there?
No, given Carol's comments on Pentecost, I just go back to that prayer during our retreat. I love that image of the fire of life and as it relates to the Holy Spirit. And so that's all positive for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're pointing to it's complex, right? There's all different dynamics depending on the situations that we're in and our particular context. Something that we talk about in calling language is the general calling and our particular callings, the general ones that we share as Christians to be, good people in the world, and then the particular context of our lives. And some, fire could look very different for different folks.
Yeah.
We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. Someone asked about the challenges you've encountered when working with congregations to use metaphors thoughtfully or effectively. Can anyone think of 1 or 2 challenges briefly that you've encountered? Given what a complex idea this can be.
I'll jump in with something. I think that just the word metaphor itself is really scary, and people think they're being asked to do something very school-like. So it's more fun if you have like a bag of objects and you ask people to choose something that kind of reminds them of an event that's going on in their life or how they're feeling called at the moment or something like that. Like you have to get playful with it, I think, for it to become real. Otherwise it feels clunky and a little bit scary or technical.
Mhm. That makes good sense.
And maybe you're right. Maybe it's how you label it, because Jesus used metaphors all the time, and people are familiar with that. But just the idea of drawing closer to those, and the label may matter.
I have a colleague who will ask you things like, well, if your vocation were a sea creature, what would it be? You have to run with that. And I think that's a really great way to go about it. You don't burden it with too much technical jargon.
That's good. Oh, excellent. Maybe we've got one last question here that maybe someone is wondering about metaphors that might be helpful when talking about a sense of call to ordained ministry in particular. And maybe while folks are thinking, if you have an idea or two off the top of your head, I'll just say something that makes the Communities of Calling initiative unique among similar programs is that each congregational team is made up of a pastor, staff member, and a lay leader. So it's neat how we have lay and ordained folks really working together to help cultivate the callings within their congregation. So just off the top of your head, any metaphors that might be helpful when thinking about ordained ministry and that calling?
I'm going to say something just first generally, that callings are really contextual. So I would say, well, it depends on that person and on their call and on what the obstacles are or what the signs are that they have the call. And when I was coming along, I encountered some obstacles, and somebody said to me, Jane, the call to ordained ministry is like water running downhill. It will always find a way. And that was a really important metaphor for me. But that wouldn't be appropriate to someone else. Right? It's just so
Sure.
contextual.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think the particularities again of each person's calling and why it can be so fun to play with metaphors, because they're so expansive. There's so many different ones. So we'd encourage folks who are listening, who may be leaders or participants in their congregation, to play around with metaphors that might work for you. And we've got lots of information on our website. Stina and Susan have been linking to the Communities of Calling webpage over here in the chat. All of our retreat materials, the booklet, those prayers that Carol and Tom referenced, they're all on our website, free for your use. We'd welcome you to use anything that might be helpful. Thank you, Carol and Tom and Jane. This has been a really life-giving conversation, and I'm sure no doubt helpful and inspiring for those who are listening, who may be looking to add a tool to their discernment toolbox, knowing that metaphor can really be a useful one. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Collegeville Connections are going to be continuing for this spring. Next Wednesday at noon Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Tia Noel Pratt, who's a sociologist of religion, whose research and writing addresses issues of systemic racism in the Catholic Church. So Dr. Pratt is going to talk about her ethnographic research on race and identity, particularly in the African-American Catholic experience. So we'd invite you to join us for that and upcoming Collegeville Connections. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour. So thank you again, Carol, Tom, Jane, our Collegeville colleagues. Absolutely. It's been good to be with you all.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.